Wisconsin has become the latest US state to target the Palestinian-led boycott of Israel, the divestment and sanctions movement known as BDS. On Friday night, Governor Scott Walker banned state agencies from working with businesses that are blacklisting Israel, saying, "We stand firmly against discrimination in any form and we wholly support our friends in Israel." Wisconsin is now the 24th state to pass an executive order or law halting BDS activity. Earlier this month, Maryland implemented a similar ban. And around the same time, Texas caused outrage after it made victims of Hurricane Harvey sign a form saying they wouldn't boycott Israel before receiving aid. These decisions made at a state level are also being supported nationally.
I'm very concerned that we may not be able to defeat this, but we are trying extremely hard to show that this is something that cannot happen. As governor in South Carolina, we were the first state to fight it off. I know how dangerous and abusive this would be, and so we'll continue fighting this the whole way through.
The BDS movement is used to battling bureaucrats since its foundation in 2005 and has strong support internationally.
No law in France forbids people from boycotting in a peaceful way for political reasons. We noticed that concerning Russia, Iran, China, and even Canada, so we don't see why Israel should be the only state exempt.
Israel recognises the threat, allocating $26 million to fight BDS last year, as well as stopping some of its supporters from entering the country in July. And Tel Aviv is being openly supported by Washington. In August, the US threatened to cut funding to the UN over its plans to publish a list of companies involved in Israeli settlement building. But BDS continues to gain support around the world. In India, 16 million members of the All India Kisan Sabha group pledged support to the Palestinian cause in recent weeks. Back in the US, those implementing anti-BDS laws say individuals still have the right to boycott Israel on their own. But civil liberty groups say those regulations are a violation of free speech. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now to discuss this further from Minneapolis, Minnesota is Jacob Milner. He's a senior policy analyst for the Israel Project, a pro-Israel think tank. And from London, we have Ben White. He's a BDS activist and the author of Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide. Thanks both so much for joining us. Jacob, let me just start with you. Why does the BDS movement not constitute a legal form of peaceful protest or collective action protected by the U.S. Constitution, as so many boycotts have before in other movements?
Yeah, hi, and thank you for having me on. This is really great, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. What sets the BDS movement from our perspective, aside from other boycott movements, is that BDS is really a form of discrimination. The purpose of the BDS movement, if you ask its founders and supporters, and it's not that hard to find this sort of information, is really not to pressure Israel, but to destroy Israel. And the focus of BDS on the only Jewish state in the world really sends a signal that this is an effort of discrimination, not an effort, human rights campaign.
Okay, Ben, is it a form of discrimination?
Well, I mean, just to pick on two aspects of what Jacob was just saying there, the BDS campaign is very clear about what it's asking for. There are three demands, all grounded in international law and the rights of the Palestinian people. They're based on the rights of the Palestinian refugees to return, the right of equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, which they currently do not have. They face systematic discrimination. And the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip not to be living under a military regime, which they currently do as well. And as for the claim that the BDS movement is singling out Israel, I mean, although this is said ad infinitum by the Israeli government and by Israel advocacy groups like the Israel Project, it's really a preposterous claim. All single-issue campaigns by nature have a single issue at their heart. And I'm not sure whether Jacob and the Israel Project have ever berated pro-Tibet, free Tibet activists for quote-unquote singling out China, or whether they've penned op-eds asking climate change campaigners why they're not writing about the arms trade. BDS is a single-issue campaign, but by trying to delegitimize it, the message is that Palestinians are uniquely undeserving of solidarity.
Jacob, I'll let you respond, and I'd actually like to ask you about another point, but if you want to respond to what Ben just said, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, Ben is missing the larger point here, is that the BDS movement, the focus on Israel, is just a long line of historical tropes against Jews in general. And we've seen recently world leaders such as Macron in France, the Secretary General, talk about how anti-Zionism is really a modern form of anti-Semitism. And the focus, when you have hundreds of territorial disputes in the world, hundreds of human rights violators in the world, and the focus on one country in the Middle East, which is by far and away the most democratic and free and progressive country in the region, really, I think, is a good question to BDS activists.
Ben, quick response. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to repeat, there are dozens, probably hundreds of active consumer boycott campaigns happening right now in North America, in Europe, all around the world. It's a tried and trusted method of civil disobedience and civil society activism. These boycotts target states, non-states. Again, the BDS campaign singles out Israel because it is Israel that has stripped Palestinians of citizenship, ethnically cleansed Palestinians in the Nakba, continues to rule millions of Palestinians today under a military regime. And actually, Jacob's remark just now highlights a really key point, which is that an underlying assumption of criticism of the Israeli government, of the Israel Project and others, this criticism of the BDS movement, the underlying assumption is that Israel is not actually doing anything objectionable enough to warrant a boycott. Now, given the vast documented evidence that Israel is today, every single day, committing grave violations of international law and human rights, to maintain that position is either delusional or, more troublingly, indicative of a worldview that sees Palestinian lives as worthless.
Okay, I'd like to look, if we can, again at the issue of constitutionality, the question of it, and we heard Senator Gillibrand of New York, in particular, criticize the actual legislation itself. She does support the anti-BDS movement, but she fears the chilling effect that it will actually have on free speech. As an American yourself, Jacob Milner, I'm wondering if you share that fear as well.
Any of these laws, the current congressional legislation moving through the process, the Cardin-Portman bill, which is the Anti-Israel Boycott Act, really is just an extension of the constitutionally upheld 1977 anti-boycott bills. And so, no, to answer your question, I don't have a concern as an American. The bills that have been passed in 24 states now, in about half the states, and bills that are moving through Congress and have been upheld as constitutional in the past, do not punish individuals and do not punish individuals for free speech, and don't punish companies for having an opinion. What they do is simply say that the state doesn't have to subsidize a company that takes a discriminatory position against Israel. I will say this is a unique situation where we've seen in about 2 years half the states in this country pass anti-BDS laws and pass them with huge majorities across the board, from states like California and Rhode Island to Alabama and Arizona, red states and blue states. And I think it's important to understand that the ferocity and the speed of these bills passing is really indicative of the understanding that the BDS movement is a discriminatory movement aimed at the only Jewish state in the world.
Okay, Ben, I realize you're not in the United States, you're not an American, but still, do you feel there's a threat there too? Could the UK perhaps start looking at similar anti-BDS laws and sanctions against companies that engage?
It's important, of course, to note that the American Civil Liberties Union, a giant when it comes to the protection of free speech and civil rights in the US, is active on this particular issue. The ACLU has described all of these state-level initiatives against BDS as being unconstitutional on the basis that political boycotts are protected by the First Amendment. But you're right to point out a wider context. Pro-Palestine solidarity activism and support for BDS has been under attack in the UK and in other countries in Europe too. And actually, there's one thing I think that Jacob was right about when he was referring to a, quote, unique sort of scenario over the last couple of years with respect to this wave of anti-BDS legislation. There is something unique about it in that here we have a state, the state of Israel, which in recent years is very anxious and worried about the growth of the BDS campaign. And it is mobilizing state resources as well as the resources of pro-Israel groups around the world to try and roll back this surge in civil society activism, to try and use various methods and tactics, including lawfare, including the use of the law to try and stifle protected free speech and legitimate political activism. So there is something unique there, and certainly the surge we saw in anti-BDS legislation in the US, as well as initiatives in Europe, come from this anxiety that the Israeli government has, an anxiety born of the fact that there is a deadlock on the ground, an apartheid status quo, and that Palestinians asking for BDS are finding more and more people willing to listen to them around the world.
Ben, let me ask you if you think it's too much of a stretch.
I will say, if I can just respond quickly.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, and I will just say one thing is that, again, the laws in the United States in no way inhibit a person from having any views or engaging in BDS. And moreover, it doesn't even stop a company from engaging in BDS. It just says that the state doesn't have to contract with that company in the same way the state wouldn't contract with groups that are involved with racism or homophobia or sexism or any other of these sort of discriminatory efforts. And one other thing I would point out is that, BDS, the Israeli and Palestinian economies are so intertwined that BDS really does hurt the Palestinians just as much, if not more, than it hurts Israelis. SodaStream is a great example of that, and I'm sure Ben is well aware of what happened with SodaStream, which was a company paying Palestinians more than a livable wage and a good wage in a settlement, and they eventually came under so much pressure that they had to pick up and leave and move across the Green Line. And had to lay off all those workers. So there are unintended consequences, and when you hear from Palestinians like Abbas talk about why he doesn't support BDS, I think that really sends a strong signal.
Ben, I'm actually interested to get your take on Abbas's stance there that Jacob just alluded to.
Sure. I mean, obviously, in the discussion about the legitimacy of BDS, and in the context of the US and elsewhere, many people have pointed to the historical precedent of the boycott campaign against apartheid South Africa that played an important role in the end of that regime. And therefore, it's amusing and illustrative to see Jacob cite a very similar argument used by people who are against the boycott in South Africa, along the lines of a boycott supposedly hurts the people it's trying to help. Palestinian trade unions, workers' groups, civil society organizations are all backing the BDS campaign. And the number one enemy, as it were, of the Palestinian economy and of Palestinian workforce is the Israeli military occupation. I mean, that's an obvious position stated by the likes of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and so on. An economy can't thrive under a colonial occupation that denies the indigenous population access to natural resources and so forth. So with respect to the impact of BDS on the Palestinians, it's Palestinians who have actually called for BDS, and it's we outside who are responding to it.
Okay, Ben, let me ask you this. I've heard some Israelis kind of scoff at the concept of BDS because they think it's so trivial. It hasn't worked. They say that, their businesses have really felt very little effect. But when you see state legislators feel they have to act at this level, sanctioning companies who subscribe to BDS, does it tell you that BDS is actually working?
Well, the BDS campaign has seen numerous specific successes. For the example of the French multinational Veolia, the British company G4S, there's been numerous examples where specific campaigns have seen particular demands met or on the process to being met with respect to ending the complicity of various entities and corporations with violations of international law being perpetrated as part of the Israeli occupation. In terms of the bigger picture, and of course BDS also involves cultural boycott, academic boycott, of which again there's been growth in all of these sectors, as well as support for BDS on campuses and so on. And in fact, one might also point out a large amount of support for BDS among faith communities. And one of the largest and most active groups supporting BDS in the US is Jewish Voice for Peace. And in terms of the big picture, there's one point that I find pro-Israel advocates often understand quite well, actually, although often they have a misunderstanding of BDS. But on one point, I think they often hit the mark, which is that one of the key roles of BDS, apart from educating people about the realities of Israeli apartheid and being an expression of solidarity with the Palestinian people's struggle. A key part of it is changing the discourse and the language and the approach to Israel, because in fact Israel is singled out by the US government, by the British government, by the EU and others, and Israel is singled out by these parties for impunity. And BDS is changing the language on that. BDS changes the conversation to one of accountability, where so far impunity for violations has existed.
Okay, Jacob, let me ask you this. The United States threatened to cut funding for the United Nations because it was going to publish a list of companies involved in Israeli settlement building. Those settlements are illegal, according to the United Nations, according to international law. So why should those companies be protected while companies that subscribe to BDS should not?
You know, I think any discussion of settlements or possibility of a two-state solution really should be left up to the Israelis and the Palestinians, the people on the ground. I don't think injecting outside sources is a productive exercise there. But if I can get back to one thing that Ben said briefly, first of all, you know, BDS is certainly a threat, but I will say that the Israeli economy over the past few years has been doing exceptionally well. You know, Israeli companies are world leaders in numerous areas, in high tech and innovation, and all of that, in cybersecurity. So I think it's important to understand that while, you know, BDS advocates try to isolate Israel, we see more investment in Israel. We see more foreign cooperation with Israel around the world. Every day it seems that there's foreign leaders in Israel to work in cooperative efforts with the Israeli government and with Israeli companies. So I think that's one important thing to understand. And what states are saying isn't that we see such a huge threat from BDS coming, so we have to create these laws. What they're saying is that BDS is discrimination, and the state is not going to fund or help subsidize discrimination. President Obama said it best, saying that, you know, people are free to their own views, but the state doesn't have to the country and the states don't have to subsidize them. And I think that's an important thing to understand, is that from our point of view, BDS is discriminatory, and discrimination should not be subsidized.
Okay. Ben, let me wrap it up with you then. Where does this legislation actually leave the BDS movement?
Well, I mean, in the US, you've got a lot of amazing groups. I mentioned Jewish Voice for Peace. There's also, of course, the US campaign. You've got groups that specifically exist to help and support Palestine activists like Palestine Legal in the face of these types of attacks. But actually, it's often the sort of throwaway marks that are the most instructive. And something that Jacob said at the beginning of his last remarks is worth dwelling on. He said, and this, of course, is a line that's very typical of pro-Israel advocacy groups, that the two parties on the ground should be left to sort of sort it out amongst themselves. Well, of course, in a situation where you have an occupier and occupied, a colonizer and colonized, a situation characterized by settler colonial power structures and a massive asymmetry of resources, then of course, if you just quote unquote leave the two sides to get on with it, then that's a recipe for a permanent status quo that's characterized by occupation, colonialism, and apartheid. And these legislative initiatives that are designed to restrict and intimidate the activities of BDS campaigners in the US and in other countries are ultimately doomed to fail, in that the main reason, the main trigger for the BDS movement, i.e. Israeli policies, are continuing. So with that respect, it's only likely that the BDS movement will continue to grow. Okay, Ben White, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this debate, but I'd like to thank you both, Jacob Milner as well, so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.